Audio check. Taylor?
Thank you. Mr. Piper, I want to continue with the topic of noise, if I may, and take
Yes, can I, just before we get going, offer you a correction? I think just before we stopped, I suggested that my rebuttal had looked at N60, and that is not the case. So I think the full weight of your point there, that the N60s and N70s hadn't been part of the assessment, is very valid.
Right, thank you. Now, I want to take you back into Mr. Williams's proof again, please. His page 46, and look at table 6, but this time we're going to look at soul levels by day. And on this page we can see that Mr. Williams identifies 10 dwellings, both in the 10 MPPA and the 12 MPPA 2030 scenarios, that are above the soul level of 63 LAQ 16 hour. And if we look on the facing page 47, and we look at the bottom half of table 7, we can see that all 10 of those properties experience an adverse increase in noise between 0 and 1 dB. So a person who is experiencing noise above the significant observed adverse effect level is a person experiencing a significant adverse effect on health and quality of life by definition. That's right, isn't it?
I think the point is that you're at an increased risk of a health outcome. Listening to a noise above the soul doesn't cause you to have a health outcome. I'm sure we're all clear on that. So people, where a population experiences adverse effects above that level, that becomes increasingly serious. The larger the proportion of the population is at that level, because it is a relative risk of a health effect.
Right. Where do we see you appraise that relative risk in your health impact assessment, Mr. Piper?
Well, I think I'm not sure that it is set out in any detail, but it is a population health approach. You know, I think I can take you to WHO night noise guidelines, if you like.
No, don't take me there. Take me to where it's set out in either the environmental statement, the environmental statement addendum, or in your proof, where you look at that risk and where you identify which proportion of the populations that you look at is affected as a result of that risk of being above soul. Where do you do that?
Certainly do it in qualitative terms. You won't find it in quantitative terms. I can take you to my proof, where I think it's either my proof or my rebuttal, where we yes. Let's look at paragraph 5.2.9 of my proof.
Thank you.
Let's
have a look. So where do we see the proportion being identified?
Well, I've said it's a qualitative assessment, which is completely valid, and we're not quantitatively telling you a number there.
I see.
And indeed, it wouldn't be appropriate. It opens with explaining that.
So an unquantified proportion. All right, thank you, that's helpful. Right, we've had a look at those 10 houses. Let's look at the nighttime position back in Mr. Williams's proof, please. And I think for that we need to be on page 49 of his evidence from memory. Yeah. And the nighttime soul level there, we can see 150 dwellings above that level in 2017, reducing to 100 at the 10 MPPA 2030 case, but increasing by 100 to 250 if planning permission is granted for the proposed scheme. So a difference between refusing and granting of 150 dwellings. Yeah?
Yes. Yes.
And if we multiply that by 2.3, that's 345 people. So on your evidence, an unquantified number of that 345 people would suffer health effects as a result of the proposed development.
A small proportion, and I think we should note there, and really it would be helpful if I took you to the WHO night noise guidance on this, because it does explain it.
Right.
Which is CD 10.34. And it's page 17, the executive summary.
Page 17, thank you. Right.
70 or 17?
Sorry, 17, 17, so XVII.
Yes.
And if I can, first to note this table, we're looking at table 3 is health effects observed in the population. And then if we look at this 55 dB row at the bottom, where we see that the situation is increasingly dangerous for public health, and the adverse health effects occur frequently, and a sizable proportion of the population is highly annoyed and sleep disturbed. So we are looking at a situation where if the whole population is at 55 dB, then we have a sizable proportion, and it is increasingly dangerous for public health. I have all sympathy with the number of residents, as you've said, who would experience this, but we are not talking about a sizable proportion of the population.
Right, okay. So the sole set by Mr. Williams is 55 dB, isn't it?
It is for night.
So your point was that at 55 dB and above there are significant health implications for the population. That's what Mr. Williams captures with his 150 houses, the 345 people that I put to you, who will experience health impacts as a result of the scheme. And you said it would be a small proportion, but now you're saying that there are increasing effects as you go above 55. Now,
for a whole population at 55.
If it is a small proportion, what do you base that assertion on, Mr. Piper?
We've done our vulnerable groups. So within our general population, we then have the populations more vulnerable to noise effects. It is a proportion of the overall population, and again, we're looking at relative risk changes for those exposed to those noise levels.
So when you've looked at sensitivity and when you've looked at vulnerability, you've taken you've looked at a proportion of the people that would be subjected to 55 dB LAQ 8 hour at night. Is that what you're saying? That's what the ES and the ESA does?
I'm saying if you want to take it all the way through to health outcomes, then only a small proportion of this small minority of the population, and again, this is a population analysis. I have every sympathy, and we can, we've looked at it at an individual level with the noise teams, but this is a population health analysis. This is what is the implication of that for population health. Is this something where public health would want there to be a heavy weight to this in planning terms?
All right.
And the answer is no.
I'm going to return to this theme later, but let's just stay with Mr. Williams at the moment and look at his rebuttal, please, page 7. And this is where he looks at the N60 index, the number of dwellings exposed to events above 60 decibels LAS max per night. And we've got a number of columns. The first column is headed 10 and captures the number of dwellings exposed to between 10 and 19 events above 60 dB LAS max per night. We've got 3,800 of those in 2017. It rises to 4,800 with the 10 MPPA case, and is 5,400 in the 12 MPPA case. So we can see that the increase associated with granting planning permission is 600 dwellings, some 1,380 people. You see that pattern?
I do see that pattern, and as noted, this is a new metric. Again, we're triangulating on trying to understand what the experience is.
Well, we're going to come on to that, don't worry. The next column is people experiencing 20 to 49 events above 60 dB LAS max. In 2017, there are 90 of them. In the 10 MPPA 2030 case, there are 100, an increase of 10. But with 12 MPPA 2030, there are 3,150 such people, an increase of 3,050 compared to the case when permissions refused. Now, just so that we can see where we take this, in re-examination of Mr. Williams, Mr. Humphreys took us all to the SONA 2021 document. I just want to explore the ramifications of what he started to explore with Mr. Williams, with you, if I may. So
I'll follow as far as I'm technically able to.
Believe you me, you're far more technically able than I am, and I'm not going to be putting anything complicated at all to you. If we look at the 2021 SONA document, we've got it as inquiry document 22. So that is in the tab on the right-hand side of the library, documents submitted during the inquiry. And hopefully we can get to inquiry document 22 and it's the right one. Yes, it is. Good. This was published in July of this year, I think possibly during the inquiry, if not immediately before. And I would like to take you, please, to page 29 of the PDF. And here we have a table which sets out the percentage of respondents indicating high self-reported sleep disturbance relating to the N60, the N60 index. Now, if you look down the rows, you can see that it's got on the very left-hand column the number of events greater than or equal to 60 dB LAS max, We've got 10 to 19, so that corresponds to the 1,380 people that we derived from Mr. Williams's table. And at the right-hand side, we can see the percentage of those who are sleep disturbed, 7.7%. That's 106 people if you do the maths. Now, Mr. Williams's table went, as you remember, from 20 to 49 as his next category. So we need to aggregate the percentages for the next 3 rows. So to do that, what I've done is to take the total number of people, which we can see in the total column, which is the second from right, 333 for 20 to 29, 183 for 30 to 39, and 147 people for greater than 40. That comes to 663 people, Mr. Piper. And we can see on the right-hand side the numbers of those who are sleep disturbed, the 36, 32.2, 20.2. And if we add those up, we get to 84.4. We can then do a percentage, 84.4 over 663, gets you to 13.3% for that category. That's the maths I've done. And 13.3% of the number of people affected in the 20 to 49 figure. Do you remember that it was 3,050 houses? 3,050 houses times by 2.3 is 7,015 people. 13.3% of that is 933. So if we add 933 and 106 together, we get to 1,038 people that would be reporting themselves as highly sleep disturbed using the data in this table.
Yes, I think we need to be a little bit cautious of this, as I took Mr. Williams to, and the SONA report reports, people over-report self-sleep disturbance, and we agreed that caveat, and that's obviously this data came out 2
But by all means re-examine your witness, Mr. Humphreys, but I think putting points like that during cross-examination really isn't appropriate, with the greatest of respect.
Yes, all right, but there was an opportunity to ask Mr. Fumicelli about this if he'd wanted to. The data was available for Mr. Fumicelli to comment on, but let the question be asked.
All right, thank you. So we get to 1,038 people highly sleep disturbed. We use the data that's in the SONA 2021 report. And we can compare that with the sleep disturbance figure that Mr. Williams reports on his page 52 of his proof of 100 people. Now, as I understand it, your health impact appraisal is based upon Mr. Williams's 100 people, but not one that had regard to the N60 approach and the sort of exercise that I just took you through that identifies potentially 1,038 people highly sleep disturbed as a result of the proposed development. That's right, isn't it?
We've got new data here, which I've tried to follow you on. I mean, that is looking at the relationship between annoyance and sleep disturbance. You know, I think if we're going to be fair and sort of look at this report in the round, you know, one can scroll down to page 33 and look at paragraphs 6.4 and 6.5.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is a report that says there is no significant relationship found between self-reported sleep disturbance and self-reported health rating.
Right.
And there is no relationship between self-reported health rating and aircraft night noise exposure levels. So I think there's I'm sure plenty we can all explore, and this is not a document that was available to the assessments, but I think it isn't pushing us in a radically different direction. I think as we've been saying, we have a main metric we look at, and then we have some supplementary metrics, and it's all about trying to triangulate, to get a measure of what is happening and the experience, and I feel we have a good measure of that, and I think we could calculate things lots of different ways. I don't think that it's helpful to do that on the spot here.
Okay. Just so that we can place the number that I got to doing the short mathematical exercise I did, the 1,038 people, applying the sonar approach to the data that Mr. Williams has produced for the N60. If we look at CD 2.5.43, at page, this is the ES appendices to chapter 16. We look at page 28.
2.5.43. And sorry, page number?
Sorry, page 28, Mr. Piper.
Yes.
So we've got the different geographical areas which you've looked at in your health impact assessment. We'll come on to see how these are utilised in a bit. But the first geographical area is site-specific, and you've got two areas of North Somerset, as I understand it. And on this page, we've got all usual residents. So we've got the total number of people in the site-specific area that you've identified there. 1348 and 1269. Yeah, around about.
We do. I think I see where you're going with this. I think we'll want to come back to how we've used these in relation to the site specific. But please, do proceed.
So, I mean, you were talking about a small proportion, you see, earlier, who would suffer effects. You've got around about 2,600 people in that site-specific geographical area. And I've got a figure of 1,038 people who would self-report them as highly sleep disturbed. In that context, 1,038 as a proportion of 2,600 is not a small proportion by any stretch of the imagination, is it, Mr. Piper?
That is correct, and the important qualification here is those two lower super output areas are selected, and I think I mentioned this in my evidence in chief, to be representative of the population, not to define the limits of effects. So I think what's missing here is of those highly sleep disturbed, what area are we looking at? And indeed, we're probably going outside of two lower super output areas.
All right, let's just have a look at the way that you've classified the noise impacts in your evidence, please. Page 32 of your proof. Paragraph 4.4.18. A minor adverse effect continues to be considered appropriate to reflect that a small minority of the local population would be affected. Now, in the light of what I've taken you to in terms of the percentage of highly sleep disturbed, applying the latest information from sonar to Mr. Williams's data to derive a figure of over 1,000 people who would be likely to self-report, do you want to change your evidence there in any way or not?
No, I think where it says local population, we can look, and we did earlier, at what that means in the health impact assessment, and that, if one wants to go into the detail, that's the Unitary Authority, which has a population of about 200,000. So if we want to stick to particular terms, I suspect we're somewhere in between. I think it's going to be across a larger number of blur super output areas. I think this is also, it's a metric that shows the same information in a different way. I mean, it's not radically different from what one would expect, to be honest, in other assessments I've done. You know, I think we're in a situation where you get more people sleep disturbed, and again, you know, there are multiple reasons for being sleep disturbed. There are, again, it's an incremental effect in terms of risk factors, and we don't equate every person who's sleep disturbed to a health outcome.
Did you ask Mr. Williams where the houses were that were affected in his evidence?
Did I ask him?
Yeah.
No, I didn't ask him.
Did you ask him which geographical area they were in?
I don't believe so, no. I think, as I've said, the site-specific area, we've purposefully not put a limit around it, and I think this speaks to the mental well-being point earlier, and the fact that none of these thresholds, even if we, you know, look it up in terms of contours, none of these are going to define the true limit of how people respond to noise. Right. And so we're careful not to have a definitive boundary around this. We've selected lower super output areas to reflect both the most immediate lower super output area and also the one in reasonable proximity with the highest degree of deprivation, so that we're getting a fair understanding of local sensitivities.
Okay, let's go back to your the original ES, please, CD 2.5.42, and let's go to page 9. Here you identify that you've chosen 4 population groups. The population near Bristol Airport, the site-specific, the population of North Somerset Unitary Authority, that's the whole local authority area, as I understand it. Is that right?
Yes.
The population of South West England and South East Wales, and the population of England and beyond the borders of England, so national and international. Now, with that in mind, I just want to understand, please, how that geographical selection of population groups works its way through the assessment process. And I want to stick with noise, if we may. So can we just head on in the document to page 40, please? And the noise and vibration operational noise section starts on the previous page to this page, and we can see at 16, 11, 14 the population groups relevant. So you've looked at the population near Bristol Airport site specific, the population of North Somerset Unitary Authority. You've looked at children and young people. Now, is that the children that are in the site-specific area, the local area, the regional area, or the national and international, or what?
So these are a sub-population in terms of vulnerabilities. So these aren't defined geographically, but they can be related in terms of our 2 geographical areas there. So we'd be looking at those vulnerable groups within those geographical population areas of the site-specific and the local.
Right, okay. And so it's the same is true for the other 3 bullet points there. You've looked at those in the context of the population within the site-specific geographic area and the entirety of the North Somerset Unitary Authority area. Yes?
It is analysis that pulls that through, yes.
Right. Okay. So let's move on down the page. We can see at 16, 11, 17, you look at the magnitude of change. The magnitude of change due to the proposed development is small. Now, is it small for, what's the geographical area that the magnitude of change due to the proposed development is small for, when you say it's small there?
Well, the magnitude relates to the factors in the table above as we discussed. So population extent is one of the factors we're looking at there. So the whole assessment is looking in terms of those geographic boundaries. We're not...
Right.
So the site-specific and the local, to answer your question.
Right. So your conclusion is the magnitude of change at the site-specific geographical level is small, and the magnitude falls within the same category for North Somerset as a whole. That's what you're concluding in 16, 11, 17. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right.
Magnitude here is somewhat independent of that geographic, framing to it. I think we've within the methods. That's clear.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So no distinction in terms of magnitude of change for those different geographic areas. We can see, can't we? Let's go down a bit further to sensitivity. Now, in terms of sensitivity then, what you have done is to identify the general population. Now, again, what geographical area are we looking at when we're looking at the general population in 16, 11, 20, first bullet point?
So again, with both, we're looking at the site-specific and the local populations.
I see. So the sensitivity of those populations to the various criteria in your table is precisely the same as between the site-specific geographic area and the entirety of North Somerset. Is that right?
For the general population, yes.
Okay. Now, the sensitivity of vulnerable groups is the next bullet point. That's considered to be high, and that reflects the presence of populations who are likely to spend extended periods near Bristol Airport. So what geographical area are we looking at there in terms of vulnerable groups?
I think we're particularly thinking for that measure. So remember, we've got a number of vulnerable groups here, and they'll be spread across an area. But in terms of those that are closer to the airport, site-specific area, then that's going to play into the sensitive vulnerable group section more. So the proximity is taken into account there. So
I'm still trying to understand. You've already looked at the sensitivity of the general population in the site-specific geographical area in the first bullet point. So this second bullet point is looking at something different, isn't it? Because it's got a different conclusion on the sensitivity of whatever area you're looking at.
Well, it's a subpopulation.
Right. I'm struggling with that first sentence, which it says it reflects the presence of populations who are likely to spend extended periods near to Bristol Airport, because that obviously applies to the site-specific category, doesn't it?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so it's this sensitivity of vulnerable groups consideration. It isn't looking at the population generally of the site-specific. It's looking at a subset thereof, but who? It's talking about residents and airport workers. I'm trying to understand what it is that you've looked at in terms of a vulnerable group here.
Well, I think this is the point I made, that if we tried to, draw a line round the population and say these people might be more sensitive and those less sensitive, that wouldn't be a fair reflection, particularly when we're talking about subjective issues like experience of noise and variability between houses of different natures and build dates. So we are deliberately not defining a hard boundary here, and indeed the best we can do is to define an indicative sensitivity for that population based on some representative local lower layer super output areas.
So this vulnerable group, the sensitive of which we're trying to identify, includes residents and airport workers who live and work in and around the airport. Is that right?
It does, yes.
And so its geographical extent in relation to this aspect is the site-specific. Yes?
It would include the site-specific. It may extend further. I mean, we're talking about people's subjective experience of noise. We wouldn't want to rule out effects to people over a much wider area.
Okay,
and indeed,
so
that's why we're framing this qualitatively.
So when we see you referring to children and young people, older people in this section, that is consideration of children and young people on a broader geographical basis than just the site-specific geographical area that you've defined. Is that right?
All of these vulnerable group categories, span the geographic groups that we've set out at the top. To throw a net over it wouldn't sort of fairly represent the extent of effects. So, look, I think it's not the case that this conclusion only applies to a very small population immediately around the airport, and the assessment says what it says, and with good reason.
All right, thank you. So when we look at the sensitivity of vulnerable groups part, when we go through the assessment process that you've adopted, we've got to remember that you're looking at a geographical area that extends beyond the site-specific. I think that's where we've got to.
Yes, so both the site-specific and the local are referenced as relevant throughout the noise assessment.
And is the same point true in respect of where you form a judgment about the sensitivity of the general population?
It is, yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. That's very helpful. Looking at the time, and I'm going to move on. Let's just see then where we get to in terms of the conclusion on your assessment for health for in the ES, because this is the one that isn't changed, I think, in the ESA. 161122, please. So you here reach a conclusion on significance of the effect for the general population, and as we've seen, that extends beyond the site-specific. That's negligible, and so that's not significant on your basis. And you reach minor adverse, not significant for the vulnerable groups, which again extends beyond the site-specific. Yeah?
Yes, these both relate to the local population and the site-specific population.
Do you remember I asked you some questions at the start of my cross-examination of you about policy and the purport of the APF and the development plan that went to establish the proposition that those documents required an assessment of the health impacts on those living around the airport. you haven't reached a conclusion in your HIA in respect of noise impacts on health that relates to that geographical area, have you, Mr. Piper?
It relates to both areas as very clearly set out.
You haven't set out the health impacts on the population living around the airport, as we've just established, because the general population extends beyond the site-specific. The vulnerable groups identified here, as you've confirmed, extends beyond the site-specific. The conclusions on significance here do not relate to the significance of health impacts from noise on those living around the airport, do they? It's drawn much more broadly. That's right, isn't it?
It's clearly presented within the assessment that both those geographical areas are represented within the assessment.
All right, let's have a look then, please, at the position in relation to air quality.
Mr. Taylor, we're about at your 2-hour estimate. I know. We're going through a fairly forensic process.
I'm sorry about that, but I can take air quality now much more quickly because of the answers I've just received, and I think I can do socioeconomics in the same way. So I'm hoping I'll be around about 20 minutes, that sort of order of things.
Okay.
But I'm sorry it's taking longer. Okay. I am getting some quite long answers too, which I'm trying to accommodate. Can we turn then, please, to staying in CD 2.5.42 to page 38. Actually, no, we need to go a page earlier, page 37, forgive me. And here we're in the air quality section, and we can see the population groups that are relevant in at 1611.5. The population near Bristol Airport, site-specific, the population of North Somerset. These are the same population groups that you looked at for noise.
Exactly, and that's deliberate so that the assessment can look through all the different determinants of health in a comparable way.
Yeah, okay. And if we scroll down to 16.11.8, we can see the magnitude of change that you've identified due to the proposed development is medium. Again, that's medium for both the site-specific and the entire area of North Somerset, because there's no distinction drawn. Is that right?
Yes, the magnitude is not geographically related.
Right. Okay. And the magnitude of change is the same also for those who are vulnerable compared to those who are not.
Indeed, yes.
Right. Okay, let's look at sensitivity next, the next paragraph down on page 38, 16.11.9. We've got the sensitivity of the general population considered to be low. Now again, that assessment of sensitivity of the general population you're talking about there is a population that extends beyond the site-specific, isn't it?
Yes, we're consistent in that.
Yeah, and your approach to sensitivity of vulnerable groups is the same here as it was in relation to noise. It
is. I think we focus in on some particular receptors in air quality, but conceptually it's the same point. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So when we come to the conclusion at 16.11.11. The conclusion is that the significance of the effect would be negligible for the general population. That's an assessment of the significance of the effect on a geographical area that extends beyond the site-specific and across North Somerset as a whole, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah. And the same is true in respect of your conclusion in relation to vulnerable groups.
That's right. We're looking at it, the wider air quality effect, indeed.
Yeah. So again, we can see no health assessment in relation to the air quality impacts on the population that lives around the airport. You've not confined yourself in that way. That's not what you've assessed, is it?
I think that's an unfair characterisation. We clearly set out the particular issues and some very localised approaching of some of the thresholds there. So there is an appreciation of particular local points. There's also the wider air quality impact. So we've been clear that we've looked at site-specific and local population.
Okay. Now, in relation to socioeconomics, it's right, isn't it, that the socioeconomic impact appraisal changed materially between the environmental statement and the addendum to the environmental statement?
I don't know about materially, but I would say that the changes were looked at, and from the health point of view, I think it's important to note, we're not just following on and saying there's major significant benefits. We're saying, what does this really mean? And looking at that data, that didn't change the health assessment. Okay,
so we've already heard at the inquiry what those changes are. I'm not going to put them to you. There's not time for one thing. Let's just. But what we can note is that the update in the ESA on health didn't change any of the conclusions in the original environmental statements assessment of the socio-economic consequences for health, did it?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. So let's have a look at those. We can stay in the document that we're in. Page 40. Hang on. This is where my notes have gone wrong. Sorry. I'm looking for 1611. 37, I think, is where I'm trying to take you.
Page 44, I believe.
Yes, thank you. I've actually got page 44 written down, but I didn't believe my own note. I'm so unreliable, even I don't rely on myself. So we can see here the geographical group that's been selected, and we've got some additions to the population group that we looked at previously here, don't we?
That's correct.
We got the site-specific and the local authority area, but now we also get South West England and South East Wales. And we've also got the vulnerable groups, I think, that we had before, but we've also added in people living in deprivation. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, if we look at magnitude of change, the magnitude of change is medium, and that is a magnitude of change that is spread across the site-specific, the population of North Somerset and the population of South West England and South East Wales. Is it from reading 161140? Am I reading that right?
Yes, that's correct. That's the extent. Clearly, it reduces towards the regional level.
All right, thank you. Then at 161141, we've got the sensitivity of the general population for vulnerable groups. Now, the general population here relates to an area extending not just beyond the site-specific, but beyond North Somerset as a whole and into South West England and South East Wales. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, again, these are not geographically related in how they're produced for sensitivity and magnitude, yeah. But yes.
Okay. And the same is true again of the vulnerable groups?
Indeed.
In geographic terms, it extends beyond even North Somerset. Right, okay. So what we need to note then is that when we get to the conclusion at 161143, the significance of the effect on the general population of minor beneficial. Now, that is a significance of effect for the general population which extends across a geographical area as wide as southwest England and southeast Wales. Is that right?
It does, and we're thinking about particularly those individuals who are benefiting from employment.
Yeah. And the moderate beneficial that you've identified there for vulnerable groups, that too it spreads across a wide geographical area, embracing vulnerable groups within southwest England and southeast Wales. Is that right?
That's correct. It relates to those in the site-specific, local and regional levels.
So what we don't have is any assessment which identifies the health benefits of socio-economic improvement brought about by the proposed development to those living in the local area, living around the airport, do we? We haven't got that assessment.
Again, it is clear that those population areas are covered within this assessment.
Yeah, right. I see, but we don't have any separate assessment that enables us to see what you say the health benefits would be to those living around the airport, do we?
I think it's no, and it's the distribution of those employment jobs, which I don't think one could do that. So,
well indeed.
I hope most of these jobs are going to be, closer rather than further, but that isn't something that we can
Indeed,
assess.
I asked Mr. Brass in cross-examination when he presented his evidence on socio-economic benefits, what the level of economic benefits on South Bristol or Weston-super-Mare would be, and he said, well, I can't answer that. That's at a level that's too fine-grained for me. If that's so for those areas, so it is in terms of the socio-economic benefits to the population living around the airport. It's simply not something that Bristol Airport Limited has presented any evidence on. Is that your understanding?
I think that is my understanding from my assessment is we can't be sure where the jobs will be. I think inspectors and everyone else can take a view on where they're likely to fall and therefore where the benefit is likely to fall.
So if it's the case then, Mr. Piper, that there is evidence of likely health impacts upon the population living around the airport, but there is no evidence of any socio-economic benefit to that same population, there is nothing to put in the balance that the APF requires that offsets the harm to the local community. That would be right, wouldn't it?
I disagree. I mean, this is clearly a Venn diagram, isn't it? You've got populations within populations, and to say that all the adverse effect will be at the very closest and all the beneficial effect will be far out at the regional level is not a reflection of the assessments, and indeed I would find it very unlikely that that would be the case.
There is no means to utilise the assessment that you have done by which one can extract from it the health impacts on the population living around the airport, is there?
It presents the site-specific level and the local level, and then as well the regional, so it is there.
That's not an answer to my question, with the greatest of respect.
So yes, it is there.
You're saying that you can extract the impact on those living around the airport from the exercise that's presented in the ES, the ESA, and your proof of evidence. You're saying that can be done.
If I read my report as I have, I can be quite clear that adverse effects are presented as falling within the site-specific and local, and those economic benefits at the site-specific local and regional. So I would find that sufficient to follow.
All right, thank you. Let me just see what else I've got here. Yes. Sorry, I'm just trying to ditch a lot of forensic points, as you might call them. Thank you. Yes, you see, the upshot of where we get to with all these questions, Mr. Piper, is that there is evidence before this inquiry of demonstrable adverse health impacts on the local community, and there is no evidence of demonstrable health benefit on that same community. And that must mean, because the impacts are adverse, that you cannot demonstrate and have not demonstrated that this proposed development will result in improvement to health and well-being in the local community around the airport. That's right, isn't it?
It's the same point you made previously, which I disagree with.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's all I'm going to put. Just check. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know I said it was forensic. I kind of understand the point. So when I go away and deliberate all
I didn't take it as a criticism at all.
Just wanted to be clear. I got it. I got where you were taking.
Okay. Don't worry. I didn't take it as a telling off.
All right. Mr. Humphreys, re-examination. Do you have a rough?
Central estimate.
Yes.
30 minutes. Not telling you what the error boundaries are around that.
Okay, all right, we'll continue then.
I think lawyers normally take it as a compliment if they're told they're being forensic. I mean, it's a kind of tick. I was forensic. Mr. Piper, you were asked early on about Public Health England, and in your evidence in chief you drew attention to what Public Health England had said, and you said Public Health England have expert people and are often involved in planning inquiries. We've not had any objection to this project from Public Health England. That's a matter of record. What do you read into that?
I would read into that they were very satisfied with the assessment as they saw it, and indeed subsequently haven't taken the initiative to again voice any other objection.
And I think at a much later stage it was put to you that the first time we'd seen any N70 or N60 data was in Mr. Williams' 2030 data. There clearly was N70 and N60 data in the original assessments, weren't there, that were seen by Public Health England?
Yes, there were a series of supplementary indicators.
And again, very early on, you were being asked about the entire approach to health impact assessment, and you said that the health impact assessment itself uses quantitative inputs where they're available, but but is itself a qualitative analysis. I mean, what does the reference paper say about that as an approach and the appropriateness of that as an approach?
It's quite clear that qualitative approaches are completely valid. We went to Appendix C, which is a lengthy methodology for health and environmental impact assessment, and that is a qualitative approach.
And why is that for health?
Well, it's because whilst there are a few cases where one can take a quantitative approach, that they don't allow you to look across the assessment, and often it's entirely disproportionate to look at them and the analysis, because they're derived at a population level, a large population level, and they have to be reapplied at a large population level to have low error margins. And that is rarely the case with planning applications at a project level.
And again, early on, you were taken in the APF to various paragraphs 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and the concept of fair balance. And you said in the reference paper, we tend to call that equity. And you were told, oh, we'll come back to that. I'll take you back to it. In CD 20.65, can we just understand how some of these concepts and equity are taken into account? So CD 20.65. And the concept introduced, I think, on PDF page 13. I think towards the bottom of PDF page 13. So, again, just to explain the point, the way in which equity and health is taken into account, and then I'll invite you to comment on a later passage as well.
Yes, so I think important understanding is that equity is different from equality. Equality is just a difference between groups. Equity is looking at whether that difference is unfair and avoidable. And equity is something we very much look to resolve through a health impact assessment. And here, again, we've got our consensus position, and the example given is significant differences in mortality or environmental risk exposure between some low and high income groups would be considered unfair and avoidable, and therefore an equity challenge. So, as with all of this, we have to look at it in context and to what extent there are issues of equity. And here we don't have significant effects in terms of the risk exposures. So I think what we do is we have particular groups who would fall into the inequalities category, and we focus mitigation to them. And I think that point is also made in the Public Health England HIA and spatial planning quite clearly.
And I'm going to touch on first an issue that Mr. Taylor then touched on early, but then returned to, and this is just population and the different population groups. So could you look at CD 2542, and let's turn to page 9. And it's at page 9 that you identify the population group. So population near Bristol Airport, site specific, then North Somerset, Southwest England and Southwest Wales, and then England and beyond the borders of England. So different population groups are looked at. And if we want to know something about those population groups, we can look at CD 2543, and I will just take you to that and then just ask you to explain some points about that. So 2543. Sorry. Yes, I do mean, goodness, I'm surprised myself, I do mean 43. I was suddenly thinking I meant 34, but I do mean 43. I've got the numbers the right way around, sorry. And in that, could I just get you to look at page 28? And it's that baseline data that we were looking at, the table 16.5. And I just want to understand then what these areas are. So if we look at site-specific, we look at the row along the top, the sort of title row, we can see site-specific, and there's North Somerset, and then 013D LSOA, and then 013B LSOA, and those are the, I think, the lower level super output areas. Just explain, I'm sure the inspectors are familiar with it, but just for the record, what are the LSOAs? What's the point of an LSOA?
So it's one of the smallest area against which you can get population data. So that allows us to look as close as we can, and those are a subsets of the wider local area. I think while we've got these two documents up, I made the point about how we use the lower super output areas as indicative of sensitivity, and back in the environmental statement where we just were at paragraph 16.2.4, sorry, 16.4.2, the paragraph immediately under that, so 16.4.3, is the reference for the point I was making, that the study areas do not necessarily define the boundaries of the potential health effects, and particularly for mental health and well-being. So that's just to give a clear reference there.
And we can see that if we look at the two LSOA areas and we look 4 or 5 lines down to the numbers of dwellings, we can see one of them has 583, the other one has 558. Do you see that?
Yes, so lower super output areas are deliberately defined by an average population, which is usually about 1,500, sometimes a bit less in this case.
Yes, and you were asked at a later stage, Mr. Taylor went through a calculation on the number of dwellings above an N70 and N60, applying sonar factors, and came up with a number, and he said that's a very high proportion. If you actually look at the number of dwellings in the 10 events, there we can see there are, in fact, thousands of dwellings. What does that tell you about the size of those N contours compared with the LSOA areas? So we've got thousands of dwellings in table 14 and just over 1,000 dwellings within the LSOAs.
Sounding very similar.
Well, are the...
Sorry, I'm not quite following the point, I'm sorry.
No, what I'm trying to understand is when we're looking at the numbers of dwellings, whether it's in LAQs or N70s, are they simply confined within those very small LSOAs, or do those effects go beyond that?
Oh, well, they're going to go far beyond, aren't they?
Yeah. And therefore, if one's wanting to make a comparison of numbers of people who might be annoyed or highly sleep disturbed, is it appropriate to compare any numbers simply with the site-specific, the two LSOA areas, or does one need to look at a wider population in order to put that in context?
Yes, no, I was very clear that these two LSOAs can't be used to define the limits of the effect in any way. That was never their intended purpose.
We'll come back to some of those concepts. A little bit later, you were being asked about methodology and determinants of significance and so on, and you were asked about how you came to judgments about significance, and that was a process that is not transparent, my shorthand. Can you, again, just, I hoped it was clear from the evidence in chief, but just explain how you arrive at judgments of significance?
Yes, so we have, as we say, various inputs to our analysis, and part of that is the quantitative inputs, part of that is characterising the local health baseline and the population, looking at the scientific literature, what local health priorities are, the regulatory standards, the policy context, and all that is relevant to making a context-based professional judgment on the significance of the health effects. And we've got the frameworks for that we've looked at the reference paper and the summary ones in the ES. I've spot here that I was picked up on the daily activities, and here in our table 16.5 that we were just looking at the bottom row, there it is. By way of one example, I said it was probably buried in the appendices there, so it is there. But yes, no, we've gone painstakingly to try and make it not a black box, to show the process. It is a qualitative analysis. It's not, it doesn't have the maybe the ability to follow it as clearly as when a quantitative analysis is set out. But that is inherent in having to do a qualitative analysis and the benefits of it. And I feel it's a very robust approach, and it's the consensus public health and impact assessment community viewpoint that's a robust approach.
Well, you've picked up one point, which was, I was going to ask you about the daily activities, and you've indicated that is shown. You were also asked about duration of effect, and had you asked Mr. Williams about the duration of the effect? I mean, did you have the LAEQ 16-hour and 8-hour noise data available?
Yes. So, I mean, duration, it's wrapped up in so many ways. I think, I take Mr. Taylor's point. It's not explicitly within that table, but it is implicitly within thinking about exposure and thinking about average sound metrics. And I think there is one small reference in the health assessment, on page 9 to duration and in terms of the noise assessment. But I don't think we need to go there. But yes, I mean, I think it would be impossible to think about the exposures to a population without implicitly thinking about duration.
And then at another point, you would, again, this was challenges to your methodology or the application of methodology. You were taken to, in CD 20.65, to figure C3. I don't think you need to look at it, but for the record, it's on PDF page 86, which was the series of concentric circles with one of the pieces of the pizza was scientific literature and then different values relating to certainty. And the point that was being put to you was, well, look, in your assessment, you haven't applied those scales every time you go through, every time you look at scientific literature. And you pointed, Mr. Taylor, in paragraph 1610.24, so this is CD 2542 again, and paragraph 1610.24. If we could just go to that, please. So PDF page 32, and you made the point there in the first bullet point in paragraph 1610.42 that you had said, well, look, the literature supports there being a threshold. Now, how does that relate to the C3 chart and scientific literature?
Well, it relates directly, and I think the point Mr. Taylor was making that was that you couldn't see that within the assessment, and I take his point. But I mean, very much the thought process within doing the analysis is exactly as represented within this reference paper. You know, it's a sort of it's a glimpse inside the mind of the impact assessor. You know, we're looking at these different thresholds, and there it is. You know, I think, you know, future impact assessments, when now that this is published, can simply refer out to that and say that's what we're thinking in terms of these thresholds. But so very much it is on a scale.
Just to see whether that was a one-off, if we just turn on to the next point at which you talk about scientific literature, which is 1610.34, which is PDF page 34. And again, section scientific literature and the fourth line.
Thresholds of effect again. Literature does not identify particular thresholds of effect.
It does not identify
and
thresholds.
The assessment.
Yes, does not. Again, is that an indication? Is that against that figure C3 approach of trying to indicate levels of certainty?
It does, and in the first sentence, you know, it uses the word association, which you know, again is linked to that figure. You know, it runs on a spectrum.
And I won't take you through every reference, but I'll just take you to one more the next time it comes up. 1610.43, paragraph 1610.43, PDF page 36. Again on scientific literature, third line from the bottom. Literature does not identify any particular thresholds for effects. Again,
indeed,
in, you know, have you applied the reference paper methodology in the way it was intended to be applied in this HIA?
Yes.
And there then came a point when you were being asked about the N70 and N60 tables in Mr. Williams' rebuttal. That's tables 1 and 2 in the rebuttal. And you made the point that there are risk factors, and it was one of the points that was touched on with Mr. Williams. First point, when one looks at the numbers of dwellings in those tables, if there is a dwelling in one of those number above 70 dB or number above 60 dB tables, does that automatically mean that for the N70, the daytime, there is that everyone is highly sleep disturbed, and in the N60 nighttime, that everyone is highly sleep disturbed?
I take your point. Yes, no, annoyance and sleep disturbance.
Sleep
Indeed,
disturbed
no,
at night
doesn't-
and annoyed during the day, if I stated that incorrectly.
Exactly. So, no, it means that there is the potential, for sensitivity within those dwellings. There is potential for a change in risk factors, and ultimately working it through to a health outcome. But that is going to be a proportion of a proportion of a proportion.
And it's that point I want to come to. So we have, in the proof of evidence, Mr. Williams' proof of evidence, Table 8, numbers of people highly annoyed, and numbers, Table 12, numbers of population highly sleep disturbed. Can you even say in relation to those numbers that all of those people suffer an adverse health effect?
No, there's a change in risk factors, and in public health, we have, concepts of sufficient and necessary cause, and these are things that you have to have for the health impact to ultimately occur, either alone or in combination. But for something like noise, it's neither a sufficient nor a necessary cause in public health terms. So it is one small risk factor amongst many others that contribute to health outcomes.
Now, in relation to that, I think one of the points that Mr. Taylor was putting to you was, in effect, look, you haven't set out some ratio or percentage or some other number that gives you, this is the number of people with health effects. How do you form judgments about that sort of thing? How do you come to these judgments that the health effects will be small?
So I think there have been some projects which have done the quantitative analyses, and it's not the normal approach, and it's not a requirement to do so, and they invariably show very small changes with very large error margins. And this is a point that's picked up in the reference paper, and it has a section on quantitative approaches and explains why in most cases it wouldn't be proportionate to do that. But what one can see from the risk ratios of the various contributory factors that we looked at cardiovascular, for example, it's very small. It means you're looking at a very small change in risk, and that ultimately leading to a health outcome is going to occur in a very small proportion of people.
And at another point, you were again being asked about the numbers of people above the nighttime SOL, significant observed adverse effect level, and we take that with the information you've just given us. But in terms of the noise policy statement for England, what's the policy requirement for properties above the SOL level? What does one try and do?
One tries to avoid.
Right, and we've had evidence previously that is normally for air noise by things such as noise insulation. When you're looking at numbers of people, for example, at night, highly sleep disturbed, and those numbers are produced by Mr. Williams, does that take account of noise insulation?
No, it doesn't. So the noise insulation scheme is not part of that modelling. I think one has to take a reasonable view that it's likely to be effective in a good proportion of cases, and therefore that help inform the overall conclusion of the likely effect. And indeed, from an equity point of view, this is exactly what we should be doing in terms of targeting the mitigation where there are particularly vulnerable groups.
And in terms of health outcomes, if that effect, that noise effect, has been avoided, what does that indicate to you about the potential health outcomes?
Well, if you've avoided the exposure, then you've avoided the change in risk factor. So you're not going to experience that change in health outcomes.
Now, we'll come back to the point that was touched on early on. There are a whole series of questions that, for noise, and then more briefly for perfectly proper reasons, air quality, and then socioeconomic, looked at the geographical area against which you formed judgments about the significance of effect, and questions were put to you about whether you look at it at the site-specific level, and we kind of touched on what those two LSOA areas are. For aircraft noise, in your view, what is the appropriate area against which to judge population health effects, and why?
Well, you have to look at a wider area, the flight paths, as shown by the various noise contours. If we were talking about a sort of construction effect, maybe you would be limited to very close to the boundary. But these are effects that go over a wide area. They're subjectively experienced, and therefore you have to take a view on the mental health and well-being implications of that over a large area.
And as part of that, and as part of looking at noise, you were asked to look at vulnerable groups and the sensitivity of vulnerable groups, and who those vulnerable groups were. You ascribed high sensitivity to those groups. Where does that sit on your spectrum of potential sensitivities?
Well, that's the highest category there is.
And so has looking at a wider area or a different area, has that in some way minimized the sensitivity that's been put into then the way you consider significance?
No, I was quite clear with Mr. Taylor that the sensitivity and magnitude deliberately don't become geographically bound within the analysis.
Same for then air quality. Obviously it's a different type of effect, but what do you say is the appropriate geographical area to look at there, and why, in order to judge a public health effect?
Again, we look at a wide area. We're thinking both in terms of the aviation contribution and in terms of the surface access contribution. So it's right that we cover an area that reflects that.
And then socioeconomic is slightly different. There, as you told us, you look, amongst other things, at wider areas, including a sub-regional, regional level. And in essence, the point put to you was that many of the impacts are more local, and yet some of the benefits you've weighed against them are wider than that. Is that an appropriate approach? And if it is, why is it?
Well, I think one has to look wide enough to see the full benefit, but clearly the benefit is going to be localized within a, the more local area of that geographic range. Look at the economic assessment and so on, particularly in terms of direct jobs.
Is it appropriate in carrying out such an assessment to confine the areas so that they're exactly the same? It seemed to be suggested that if the impacts were immediately around the airport, one should only look at the benefits immediately around the airport. Is that appropriate?
No, you would miss some of the benefit, if one did that, but the assessment has deliberately included a consistent series of geographic areas so that is represented within the analysis. And
final point, we know that the data on jobs and gross value added at a local and sub-regional and wider area is agreed between Mr. Brass and Mr. Sirat. And many of those jobs, several hundred of them, are in the North Somerset area. Is there any reason to believe that those jobs will not bring health benefits for the people who take the jobs that are local, certainly to North Somerset and the areas around North Somerset?
Those jobs will be very beneficial to health, particularly where they relate to vulnerable groups. That this can be transformational for health. And I think one has to remember that, with the environmental exposures, we're talking about very small incremental risk factor changes, something like moving from unemployment to employment. That has huge health consequences, both for those individuals and their dependents, and then the additional economic activity that generates. So it's very clear in sort of public health terms that you want people to be in good quality jobs, and that's a very important driver of population health.
Mr. Piper, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Piper.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's it for then health today. Tomorrow we've got the conditions session. We'll start with air quality and we'll go on to noise. I have had an email through with a document, I think, so everyone's been busy this morning, which is good. There is a comment in that email that says we understand that the council are looking to update this table before the round table session. Do you know anything about that, Mr. Taylor? I appreciate you've been in this room with us.
Yes, that's why. My client's been unable to have the benefit of advice from Mr. Henderson or myself on that table.
Okay.
So we haven't, because we've been here.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're going to do our best now to update it as quickly as we can and get our position before you, so you're not up at midnight.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. Well, we'll review that. I mean, we'll start and take a look at this table anyway. But as soon as you can get it to us, and printed copies would be helpful, so I can scribble on them.
Our best to get those.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Okay. Well, any other procedural points to raise before we finish today? No. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We shall reconvene at 9:30 tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.